The night Nora Finch stood in the middle of Ashford Hall's great dining room, with 30 pairs of eyes upon her and a dead woman's miniature in her palm, she understood that she had two choices left. She could set the small portrait on the table and walk away without a word, carrying herself out of the hall the same way she had arrived, quietly and without fuss. £12 a year richer, and no more significant to the world than she had been before. Or she could cross the room to Edmund Vane, the Duke of Ashford, and place the miniature directly into his hands, and speak the truth about where she had found it, and accept whatever came after that, including the possibility that what came after was nothing at all. She had learned, across 4 months at Ashford Hall, not to expect very much from the possibility of nothing at all. That is where this story ends. Here is where it begins. Nora arrived at Ashford Hall on the 4th of November, carried in the back of a carrier's cart from the coaching inn at Marsley Village, her single trunk wedged between a crate of bottled claret and a roll of carpet felt. She was 22 years old, the daughter of a dead clergyman, and she had £12 a year coming to her in exchange for cleaning rooms and carrying trays and keeping her opinions to herself. The claret was better secured than she was. The carpet smelled of dust and previous households. She held her coat closed at the throat with one gloved hand and watched Ashford Hall rise out of the gray November morning like something that had been waiting there longer than the surrounding hills. It was a large house. She had known large houses before, briefly, as a visitor in her father's parish days, but she had never lived inside one, and the distinction, she was about to learn, was considerable. Large houses employed hierarchies that rivaled anything the county's social registers could produce. There were women who had held their stations in a house like this for 20 years, and who would communicate their authority over a new maid-of-all-work through the angle of a turned shoulder rather than a spoken word. There was a butler named Dawson, elderly and precise, who showed her to her room in the upper servants' quarters with the courteous formality of a man who had been showing people to rooms for 40 years and who had decided long ago that courtesy cost nothing and cruelty cost more than people calculated. He carried her trunk himself, which was unexpected, and said only that the house was quiet at present and that she should find it so until the guests arrived for the winter dinner at the end of January. She asked carefully, "How many guests?" 30, he said, all seated. His Grace preferred an ordered table. She thanked him and unpacked her trunk, which held 2 plain gowns, her father's Bible, a small locket containing no portrait because the portrait had been given away before she could prevent it, and a copy of a French novel she had read 4 times on the grounds that French novels improved the mind and cost nothing once acquired. She had been assigned the upstairs gallery among her other duties, which meant she polished the long pier glasses and swept the bare floor on Tuesday and Friday mornings, and attempted to keep the dust from settling on the framed portraits that lined the room's south wall. The gallery was cold in November. Her breath showed in the air. She learned the faces in the portraits by name, first from the brass plates on the frames, and later from Dawson, who was willing to speak about the house's history if she asked a direct question, and seemed to prefer directness to indirection. There was the old Duke, Edmund's father, painted with the flat authority of a man who had not questioned his own expression since the age of 30. There were 2 sisters, long since married elsewhere. There was a woman painted in pale blue, young, with a direct and gentle gaze, whose portrait was the only one without a nameplate. Nora asked Dawson about her during her second week. The old butler's face did not change, but something behind it did. "The late Duchess," he said at last. His Grace had removed the plate. Nora did not ask anything further that day. She saw Edmund Vane for the first time at the end of that second week, in the corridor outside the library on the ground floor. She was carrying a coal scuttle and he was walking fast from the direction of the estate room, papers in one hand, jaw set in the manner of a man who has recently received information he intended to contest. He stopped when he saw her, not because of her specifically, she assumed, but because the coal scuttle occupied most of the corridor's width, and she had no immediate way to move it. She stepped back against the wall. He looked at the coal scuttle, and then, briefly, at her. "The library fire is Dawson's responsibility," he said. She had not known this. She said so, plainly. He studied her for a moment with the gray eyes that matched, she had noticed from the gallery portraits, no one else in the family's painted lineage. They were the particular gray of cold river water, still on the surface and moving below it. He said, "What is your name?" She told him. "Miss Finch." He said, "Go back upstairs, Miss Finch. Dawson will manage the fire." She went. She set the coal scuttle in the passage at the top of the stairs and reported to the housekeeper, Mrs. Crane, that she had apparently been assigned a task that did not belong to her. Mrs. Crane regarded her with the expression of a woman who had managed a large house for 15 years and who found new staff either immediately tractable or immediately troublesome, and was still forming her assessment. She said only that Miss Finch would do well to avoid the ground floor rooms during His Grace's working hours. Nora did not argue. She had £12 a year riding on not arguing. She did notice, however, that the library fire had not been cold when she found it. Dawson had already tended it. The Duke had sent her away from a room she had no practical reason to be in, and the reason he had given was a procedural fiction. And it had worked because she was a maid. And he was the Duke of Ashford. And the fiction did not need to be true to function. She did not yet know what to make of that. Lady Morrow arrived the following Monday in a carriage so well appointed it made Ashford Hall's own equipage look modest. She was Edmund's widowed aunt by marriage, a woman somewhere in the region of 50, who wore her rank like a structure built around herself, rather than clothing worn upon a body. She was not, Nora observed, unkind in the obvious sense. She did not raise her voice. She did not throw things. She was precise and confident. And she spoke of people in terms of their usefulness to a particular social outcome, and she measured that usefulness with the calm accuracy of a woman who had been doing such measurements her entire adult life. She brought Cecily Holt with her. Cecily was 20 years old and polished to a finish that could have passed for diamond. She wore a deep rose carriage dress that had not been retrimmed twice. Her gloves fit perfectly. She entered the hall with the specific confidence of a young woman who had been told, consistently and by people whose authority she respected, that she was the correct answer to whatever question was being asked. Lady Morrow presented her to Edmund at tea the first afternoon, with the tone of a woman confirming a previous arrangement. Edmund acknowledged the introduction, with the level courtesy he apparently applied to all external stimuli, and said very little. His expression did not change. He looked, Nora thought, carrying away the tea tray, like a man attending a proceeding he had agreed to submit to on the understanding that its outcome was not yet fixed. It was at that tea, as Nora reached for the second sugar pot that Cecily had shifted too close to the table's edge, that Lady Morrow first spoke the words. "Careful," she said. Not to Nora, but about her, to the room in general, in the manner of someone identifying a piece of furniture that had been left in an inconvenient position. The Orphan Maid is a little overreaching today. The room's small sounds continued. Cecily's spoon touched her cup. Edmund read his correspondence. No one looked at Nora. This was, she would come to understand, precisely the point. The remark was not meant to cause her pain in front of witnesses. It was meant to remind the room of the category to which she belonged, efficiently and without drama, so that the category continued to function. She set the sugar pot back in its place and left the room without incident. She was in the gallery the following Friday morning, working from the east end toward the west, when she heard the sound from the passage below the gallery's north wall. Not a sound the house made, stone settling or a shutter's edge in the wind, but a human sound, a low cough with the quality of a child trying not to make noise and failing. She followed it. It led her down the back stair to the passage connecting the gallery to the stable-yard door, and there she found Thomas. He was 11 years old, and he was a stable boy, and he was sitting against the stone wall of the passage with his knees drawn up and his face the color of old wax. He had been there, she estimated from the look of him, for some hours. Someone had told him he was not needed in the stable-yard until he felt better, which had apparently meant to an 11-year-old boy who slept above the stables and had no room in the main house to retreat to, that he had found the nearest indoor passage and remained there because he had no better option. His fever was real, and it was not minor. She took off her own shawl and put it around his shoulders and asked him his name and whether he had eaten. His name was Thomas, and he had not eaten since the previous morning. She went to the kitchen, which involved passing Mrs. Crane in the corridor, and she asked for broth and bread and a glass of water, and she did not frame these as requests, but as statements of immediate need. Mrs. Crane said that a stable boy was not a matter for the house's kitchen. Nora said that the stable boy was feverish and without shelter, and that she intended to remain with him until someone with the authority to arrange better accommodation did so. And she said it in the plain, level tone of her father's sermon delivery, the one that left no procedural purchase for disagreement. Mrs. Crane's expression moved through several stages rapidly before arriving at a controlled neutrality. She produced broth and bread. She did not produce warmth. Nora spent the rest of that Friday morning in the passage with Thomas and the better part of the afternoon. She read to him from her French novel in English, since French was not a language he possessed, pausing at the vocabulary he found funny and letting him find it funny without embarrassment. She wetted her handkerchief from the water glass and laid it across his forehead when the fever climbed. She did not think about the gallery, left half polished, or the hour she was losing in her daily count of tasks. She thought about whether the fever was cresting or building, and whether, if it built further, she had enough authority in this house to compel someone to send for a physician. She did not know, until much later, that Edmund had seen all of it. The observation gallery, Nora would learn, ran the full length of Ashford Hall's upper north wing, and against its interior wall, behind a section of paneling that appeared to be solid oak from the corridor side, Edmund had installed an arrangement of silvered glass that allowed him to observe the passage below without being seen. It was an architectural curiosity that had existed in the house's original design as a means of surveying the stable-yard approach, and he had adapted it, during the months before the winter season, for a purpose that bore his particular quality of cold deliberation. He had, she would eventually understand, watched every candidate his aunt presented. He had stood behind that panel and observed them in the passage below in moments they believed were unobserved, and he had formed his assessments in the quiet manner of a man who trusted his own perception and trusted no one else's. He had told himself this was practical. He had told himself it was the rational response to a situation that required clear judgment, unclouded by the performance that attended formal introductions. He had not expected to watch a 22-year-old maid-of-all-work spend an entire Friday tending a sick stable boy with a wet handkerchief and a French novel read aloud in English. He stood at the panel for longer than he had intended. He went back to his papers. He came back. He watched her lay the handkerchief across Thomas's forehead with the same care one employed for irreplaceable things, and he felt something shift behind his ribs in the place where, for 4 years, He had been careful to feel nothing. His first wife had died 4 years before Nora arrived. Her name had been Caroline, and she had been 23 years old, and she had died in the early hours of a March morning in the room at the end of the East Corridor, while Edmund stood outside the door, and a physician told him there was nothing more to be done. The child had not lived either. He had been told, afterward, by people who meant to comfort him, that there was nothing he could have done. He had not believed this. He had been cold and preoccupied and absent through the months when presence might have mattered, and Caroline had borne it with a patience that had, in retrospect, broken something in him. He had come to believe that what he felt had killed her. Not his cruelty, which was not in him, but his absence, which was. His trained habit of standing outside the warmth of a thing rather than inside it. He had believed, in the 4 years since, that this quality was fixed in him and final, and that whatever a second marriage required of him, warmth was not among the things he could produce. He had not planned to watch The Orphan Maid. If this story has moved you in any way, leave a word in the comments below. There are more stories here, and your presence at each of them matters. Edmund did not speak to Nora about Thomas directly. He did not send a message or give an order that named what he had seen. What he did was tell Dawson, the following morning, that the stable boy who had been feverish was to be given the small room off the tack passage until he recovered, and that the kitchen was to provide him 3 meals a day until further notice, and that Mrs. Crane was to be informed this was not a request. Dawson received this information with the unreadable precision of a man who had served this family for 30 years and who was constitutionally disinclined to express surprise. Then Edmund walked the length of the north corridor and stopped at the point where the gallery passage met the stair and stood for a moment with his hand flat against the wall, which accomplished nothing practical, but which he did regardless. The proximity began to accumulate in small, counted increments. There was the morning in the library, 3 days after the Thomas episode, when Nora arrived to dust the shelves and found Edmund already at his desk, which was not supposed to happen during her cleaning hours, and she worked the shelves in careful order without speaking, and he did not send her away this time. He read. She worked. The room held the particular quality of shared silence that is different from solitude, denser and more present. A silence that knows it is being kept by 2 people. When she reached the shelf nearest his desk, she found a volume wedged spine inward, which was the kind of thing that troubled her on instinct, and she drew it out and turned it the right way and replaced it. And when she looked up, he was watching her with an expression that was not quite the one he wore for everything else. He said, "You read French." She had not displayed this. She asked, carefully, how he knew. He said only that the novel on the passage shelf outside the gallery was a French novel, and it belonged to no one in the house except her. He said it without inflection, the way he said most things, so that the act of paying that particular attention seemed, on the surface, procedural. She said yes, she read French. Her father had taught her. He asked the father's name. She told him. The late Reverend Finch of Marsley Parish, who had left behind a library of 400 volumes and debts of comparable weight, and who had been the kind of man who believed daughters deserved the same instruction as sons, which was an opinion the world had not shared. Something moved briefly behind Edmund's gray eyes, there and gone, a recognition of something she had not intended to put into her words. He said, "I am sorry for your father's death." She said, "Thank you, Your Grace," and continued dusting, because there was nothing else to do with a sympathy that was genuine and could not be answered. He watched her for another moment, and then returned to his papers, and she did not look at him again until she had finished and was leaving, at which point she found that he had, without her noticing, crossed the room and was holding the door open for her. She stopped. He said nothing. She walked through. The door closed behind her with the soft, certain sound of a well-fitted frame, and she stood in the corridor for 3 seconds more than was necessary before she resumed her rounds. There were 4 more such moments across the following weeks. A cold afternoon in the gallery when she discovered a crack in one of the pier glass frames, and he appeared in the doorway behind her while she was examining it, and stood very near her shoulder for a moment while she showed him where the wood had split, near enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold room. And then he said he would have Dawson send for the glazier, and stepped back and left. An evening on the main stair when she was carrying a loaded tea tray and misjudged the step, and his hand came around her arm from below and steadied her before she had processed that he was there, and he said only, "Careful," in a low voice that was different from the way the word had sounded in Lady Morrow's mouth. And she stood on the step for a moment afterward, not entirely certain of the arithmetic of the thing. A morning in the garden corridor when she came around the corner fast and walked directly into him. And neither of them moved backward for a beat that lasted long enough to be a choice. He said very quietly, "Miss Finch." She said, "Your Grace." Her voice came out level. She was proud of this. He said, "You have color in your face," which was not a sentence she could interpret with certainty, and he said it looking at her with the full weight of his attention, which was considerable. And then he walked on, and she held onto the doorframe beside her and thought, with some precision, that she was in a great deal of difficulty. Lady Morrow noticed. This was what Lady Morrow was for. She did not confront Nora directly. That was not her method. Her method was architectural, the way she arranged people in rooms and conversations so that the pressure was applied by the room's logic rather than her own visible hand. She began to speak of Cecily and Edmund as an established thing in Nora's hearing, which she could do by simply addressing comments to Cecily about the North Wing's redecoration while Nora was within earshot, or by asking Edmund at table how he found Miss Holt's opinion of the park, in the same tone one used for matters already settled. Edmund gave these gambits the same level attention he gave everything, and responded to them with brief, courteous non-answers that satisfied the surface while committing to nothing. The second voicing of the label came at the beginning of January, when Lady Morrow intercepted Nora on the gallery stair with a query about whether the pier glass in the west corner had been adequately attended to, and remarked, in the presence of Cecily and the Holts' visiting cousin Miss Granger, that it was remarkable what certain people in certain positions imagined themselves permitted to aspire to, and that the Orphan Maid would do well to remember that aspiration was a luxury purchased by station. Miss Granger had the grace to look at the floor. Cecily looked at the wall. Nora looked at Lady Morrow directly and said, "The pier glass was attended to on Friday, my lady," and went back downstairs and did not permit herself the luxury of shaking until she reached the kitchen passage. In the first week of January, she found the miniature. It was a Tuesday morning, gallery duty, and she was working near the east end when the small object caught the light from the high window and stopped her. It had fallen or been placed on the narrow ledge behind the largest portrait, the old Duke's, where the wall angled and the ledge was invisible unless one stood precisely where Nora was standing. It was a miniature portrait, oval, set in a gold frame with a blue enamel border, and it showed a young woman in pale blue with a direct and gentle gaze. Nora held it for a long moment. She recognized the face. It was the face from the portrait on the gallery's south wall, the late Duchess, the one whose nameplate Edmund had removed. She set it on the flat of her palm and looked at it with the careful attention one brought to something that was not hers. And that cost something to someone whose name she knew. She thought about how it might have come to be on that ledge. She thought about the observation panel in the north wall, the one she had only recently understood the full purpose of. She thought about the fact that Edmund had stood behind that panel, looking down at the passage below, and that the ledge was near enough to where a person might brace their hand against the wall while standing at the panel that a chain or a pocket loop could have given way without their noticing. She put the miniature in the pocket of her apron, where it stayed. She thought, over the following days, about what to do with it. She could give it to Dawson, who would return it without theater. She could leave it somewhere conspicuous. She could simply go on carrying it and decide nothing, which was the option that required the least of her. She did not give it to Dawson. She did not leave it somewhere conspicuous. She carried it and thought, and the miniature was warm in her apron pocket in a way that small metal objects should not have been, and she suspected this was not the miniature, but herself. It was Dawson who, without intending to complete any circuit, told her what he knew. He came to find her in the gallery one afternoon in the middle of January, ostensibly about the glazier's scheduled visit for the pier glass, and stayed, in the manner of old men who have held things a long time, to speak about matters adjacent to the ones he had come for. He talked about the house in Edmund's father's time, and about Caroline, the late Duchess, and about what manner of woman she had been. Quiet, he said. Steady. She had a quality of paying full attention to the person she was speaking to, regardless of that person's station, which was, he observed with the careful neutral voice of a man who was not comparing things out loud, not common among people raised in the certainty of their own consequence. He said His Grace had not gone near the nursery wing in 4 years. He said the portrait in the gallery was the only one in the house that His Grace had ever stood before, long enough to constitute something other than passing. He said, "He is not a cold man, miss. He is a man who has concluded that he ought to be." Nora thanked him and stood at the gallery window after he left and looked at the grounds below, where frost had silvered the paths between the hedges, and felt the miniature in her apron pocket like a small weight placed there by something larger than coincidence. The winter dinner was set for the 28th of January. 30 guests, all seated. His Grace preferred an ordered table. The preparation consumed the house for a week beforehand, and during that week Lady Morrow moved through the rooms with the particular momentum of a woman exercising authority in her preferred arena. She reorganized the seating twice, placing Cecily at Edmund's right hand, and then at the head of the arrangement that faced his chair, so that wherever he looked down the table's length, he would find Cecily arranged for his consideration. She inspected the flowers twice. She told Nora, on the afternoon before the dinner, that the corridor outside the dining room was not her station on the night of the event, and that she should confine herself to the kitchen passage. Nora said yes, my lady, and meant none of it. The dinner was the third voicing, which Nora had not planned to be present for, but was, because she was carrying a tray of additional candles through the serving corridor, when Lady Morrow, at the sideboard, said to Mrs. Crane in a voice pitched exactly for the carrying quality of a plaster-walled corridor that she hoped no one had encouraged the orphan maid to entertain ideas above the capacity of an orphan maid, because the winter dinner was not a situation that required her presence or her aspirations, and the sooner she understood the limited frame of her future here, the better for everyone's comfort. Mrs. Crane said nothing. This was, in its way, a kind of answer. Nora set down the candles, straightened the tray, and walked into the dining room. She had not fully decided to do this until she was already doing it. She crossed through the serving door into the room where the 30 guests were settled, along the white length of the table, the candelabras burning at intervals, the crystal catching the light, Cecily in deep rose silk at Edmund's right hand, Lady Morrow at the room's social center, face arranged in the expression she wore when a situation was unfolding as she had designed it. Edmund saw her from the head of the table, She looked at him steadily and put her hand into her apron pocket and took out the miniature. The room was not silent. It went on with its soup and its conversation and its small interchanges of opinion about the winter roads and the Holt's estate in Hampshire, and whether February would be as hard as January. Lady Morrow's face did not change yet, because she had not yet read the room correctly. Cecily looked at Nora with the expression of a person who has been told they are the correct answer to a question and has just noticed someone else has been admitted to the room. Nora crossed to the head of the table. She held the miniature out, level, in her open palm. She said, in a voice that was not large, but that was entirely without apology, "I found this in the gallery, Your Grace, behind the East portrait. I believed it should be returned to you." The room found its quiet, not all at once, but in the manner of 30 people, gradually understanding that the temperature of the air had changed. Conversations thinned. Soup spoons stilled. Lady Morrow's fan, which had been moving at a measured height, paused. Edmund looked at the miniature in Nora's palm. He looked at it for a long moment, and then he looked at her. And what moved through his face was not what Lady Morrow would have chosen for the room to see. It was not the level courtesy he wore for everything else. It was something that had been behind the gray eyes for 4 months, accumulated in deposits she had not known she was recording, and it was now entirely present on the surface in front of 30 witnesses, and Lady Morrow could not unplace it. He stood. The room's quiet became something else entirely. Several guests had the instinct to look at their plates and looked at the head of the table instead. He said, "Miss Finch." She said, "Your Grace." He said, "Will you stay?" And it was not a question in the grammatical sense, and it was not a command in the procedural sense, and it was not addressed to the room or to any consideration the room held. He said it to her, with the full weight of a man who had decided something in the last 30 seconds that had taken him 4 years to approach. He picked up the miniature from her palm, carefully, and he held it for a moment, in the way one held things that had been lost and then returned. The particular quality of stillness that was not absence, but presence reversed. Then he said, "Dawson," without looking away from Nora. Dawson, who was at the room's edge where butlers positioned themselves during dinners so as to be audible to a single word and invisible to the general situation, said, "Your Grace." Edmund said, "The East Corner room is to be prepared tonight." He said it at the table's full volume, where the full table could hear it. And someone should let Mrs. Crane know that Miss Finch's duties above stairs are concluded. The 30 guests did not, as a collective body, know exactly what they were witnessing, but they were people of the Regency, and they were practiced readers of the room's air, and every one of them understood that the Duke of Ashford had just said something irrevocable in a public setting, and that the woman standing at the head of the table, in an apron and plain gray wool, was the reason he had said it. Lady Morrow understood before anyone else. She was, Nora thought, watching. Not a foolish woman, and she had miscalculated in the specific way that competent people miscalculated when they trusted their instruments, and their instruments had not accounted for the variable standing in front of her. Her fan resumed its movement after a moment, but at a different height, and the expression she wore for the rest of the dinner was the expression of a woman recalibrating something fundamental. Cecily set down her soup spoon. She looked at Edmund for a long moment, and then she looked at Nora with an expression that was not, in the end, the triumphant one she had arrived with, and not the devastated one she might have displayed. It was something quieter and more honest. The expression of someone seeing, perhaps for the first time, the difference between being the correct answer and being the chosen one. She looked at her plate. She did not cry, which Nora thought well of her for. The procedural conversations happened in the days that followed, the formal ones that the period required. The solicitor brought down from London, Dawson as witness, a morning in Edmund's study where the words were said plainly and the intentions were confirmed without theatrical speeches. There would need to be a special license, since neither of them had the inclination for a long engagement given the duration of the restraint they had already observed. Nora said this last part in her father's plain delivery, and Edmund looked at her with the gray eyes that were not cold at all when one was close enough to see them properly, and said, "No, I think not a long engagement." She asked him directly, on the morning the solicitor came, whether he had watched her through the mirror in the gallery. He said yes. She asked when. He said, "The day with the stable boy," and several times after. She said, "And the library? And the corridor?" He said those had been something else. He said them with the precision of a man who had thought about the difference and knew what it was. She said, "You might have spoken to me." He said, "I know." He said it without defense, in the tone of a man who had arrived at the cost of something and was not asking to be excused from paying it. He said, "I needed to see what was true before I was willing to want it." She thought of the miniature in the apron pocket. She thought of £12 a year and the carrier's cart and the claret crate. She thought of Thomas in the passage with his knees drawn up, and the wet handkerchief, and the French novel read in English, and the part of her that had carried all of it without expecting anyone to notice. She said, "I know what that is." He looked at her for a long moment, and she looked back, and neither of them looked away. The snow came in February, the way it did in that part of the country, quietly and in earnest, beginning in the night and continuing through the morning until the park was a white field and the paths between the hedges were erased. Nora stood at the window of the east corner room, which was warm now, with a fire laid and curtains of deep green that had been there since before her arrival, and that she found she did not want to change, and she watched the snow cover the stable yard. Below, moving across the yard's white expanse with the careful steps of a boy not quite recovered, but insisting on it anyway, was Thomas. He was wearing a coat that was slightly too large for him, which was the coat Dawson had found in the house's store of outgrown things, and he was carrying a bucket with both hands in the manner of someone who had been told to take it slowly, and was complying at approximately half the rate the instruction had intended. He looked up at the window, because 11-year-old boys invariably look up at windows when they are trying to appear occupied by other things. And he saw her, and his expression moved from studied concentration to something considerably less guarded. She raised her hand. He raised his free hand in return, and the bucket tilted, and he grabbed it back before it went. And she pressed her lips together to keep the smile inside, which did not entirely work. Edmund came to stand behind her. She heard his step and felt the warmth of him, and did not turn around yet, watching Thomas make his deliberate way across the yard. Edmund's hand came to rest at her shoulder, not heavy, only present, a quality of being there that was different from merely occupying the same room. Dawson appeared at the yard's far edge. He said something to Thomas that she could not hear through the glass. Thomas stopped walking and appeared to listen, and then appeared to argue, which was consistent with what she knew of him. Dawson said something further. Thomas conceded the argument, which was not consistent, but which spoke well of Dawson's authority. She turned, at last, to look at Edmund. He was watching the yard too, his face in the winter gray light finally without the quality of defending something. He had Caroline's miniature in his coat pocket now, restored there by his own hand the morning after the dinner. And she knew this not because she had seen him place it there, but because she knew him. In the way one came to know a person who had been demonstrating their character for 4 months in the assumption that no one was watching. She had been watching. He looked down at her. His hand moved from her shoulder to the angle of her jaw, careful, the way he was careful with all irreplaceable things. She said, "Thomas is going to spill that bucket." He said, "Yes." She said, "Dawson will not let him." He said, "No." Outside, the snow went on falling through the cold morning air, softening the edges of the yard and the hedges and the long front drive that led away from Ashford Hall toward the coaching road and the carrier's cart and the life she had arrived from. Inside, the fire cracked in the grate behind them. The green curtains held the room's warmth. The miniature rested in Edmund's pocket with the quiet certainty of something returned to where it belonged. She had come to Ashford Hall with a trunk, a Bible, and a French novel, and £12 a year. And the particular resigned courage of someone who has learned to expect nothing and has continued acting from her values regardless. She had not expected to be seen. She had not expected the gray eyes in the corridor, the held door, the steadying hand on the stairs, the words spoken low that meant something different than its surface, the long moment at the head of the table when irrevocability was chosen in front of 30 witnesses. She was seen. Dawson crossed the yard below and reached Thomas and took the bucket from him in the manner of a man who had decided the matter. And Thomas appeared to say something that made the old butler's shoulders shift in a way that, across the distance of snow and glass, looked remarkably like laughter. Edmund's hand was warm at her face. The snow fell on. If you have followed Nora's story to this quiet room, leave a comment with the moment that stayed with you. There are more stories waiting here, and every one of them is grateful for your company.